My path to LeTourneau has been certainly one with many twists and turns, as God usually likes to do. I have always loved writing. I've always loved teaching writing. I've always loved exploring God's gifts through story. And that led me to Wheaton College for undergrad, and eventually to the University of Maryland for my graduate work in creative writing. And so I got to see the best of both worlds, what it was like to be a Christian student and what it was like to be a student at a secular university. And I quickly learned in graduate school that there was so much about Christian education that I missed, that I longed for. I think a lot of the world likes to look at Christian education and say it is limiting, or it's all about censorship, or it's all about looking very narrowly at the world. And my experience was totally the opposite. It was actually in grad school where I felt like there were conversations we couldn't have. There were elephants in the room, so to speak, that we couldn't talk about. And so I always knew that I would wind up at a Christian institution. And so LeTourneau for me is that sort of place, that destination, where we can explore anything and everything couched within the kind of narrative of God, and to look at the world through a Christian lens, while standing on a foundation of truth, of curiosity, of kind of intellectual pursuits, exercising the minds that God has gifted us, I think is so important. And so I always knew that I wanted to wind up at a place like LeTourneau. And kind of providentially, God led me from a failed visa application to teach at a university in the Middle East to teaching at a college in the Midwest, and for 4 years, and then now I find myself here at LeTourneau, and that has been a huge blessing. So for me, writing has always been a way to exercise what God has given me, to find myself placed within this larger narrative of God. And so narrative writing is so important, to see how my story fits within a larger story. And that's the kind of thing I try to impart to my students, is just, what is it that we are going through, and what is it that our neighbor is going through? How can we learn more about the human experience, about each other, and grow in the pursuit of virtue and all that? And so that's been huge for me. I often think of Ephesians 2:10, where Paul says, "For we are his workmanship," or his masterpiece, or in the Greek, it's poema. And so as a poet, I like to steal that one. Poema meaning, we are something that is made. We are a handiwork of God. And so I think that means several things. That means that as a writer, first of all, God has created me. He's created those who are around me. We're all children of God, and God has made me so that I can make, which I think is something that fits and resonates so well with LeTourneau. God has made us to be makers, or as J.R. Tolkien says, we are sub-creators. We are created to create. And so that is something as a writer that I love to impart to students, to model that. I think of, that often quoted Eric Liddell quote, what Chariots of Fire was based off of, when he says, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. Well, when I write, I feel God's pleasure. When I teach, I feel God's pleasure. And I try to, encourage students to find what it is that, where it is and what it is that you feel God's pleasure. What is it that you do that you feel resonates with your calling and what the talents and the skills that God has given you. And so that is, that's important for me. And so I've always been a writer. I've always, considered imagination, considered creativity a part of the things that God has given me to grow in and to develop and to fail at, to struggle with, but also, to continue to hone and to work at and to shape and to craft. And so that's so important for me. So I thought I would share a poem from my recent collection that kind of exhibits, I think, what it's like to tell a story and to just kind of hear the kind of language that God's given us, and to tell a story about friendship, to tell a story about fellowship, to tell a story about how important place is as a Christian, as a person of faith. And so let me read that for us. This is a poem called Botha River, which is about a river that grew outside of, kind of wound itself around my hometown where I grew up, which was a few miles south of the Sahara Desert in Chad in Africa. My parents were missionaries. And so this river, for me, is such a symbol of life and of, as we often see in Scripture. And this river was a place of celebration because for most of the year it would be empty. It would only fill up when the rains came. And so when the river came, when the rains came and the water filled up and it would kind of spill over from a lake that was to the south, fish would come in, and it was just such a joyous occasion to go there with friends and to just participate in this together. So let me read this. Botha River. They say this land was once an ocean, but I have not found the shells to prove it. The dry riverbed slithers like the trail of a prehistoric snake, its scales leaving the ruts and cracks along the bank, dried and caked, sandstone by sun and drought. As a child, I came to it, the Botha. I saw a sea of dunes dimpling the surface, saw a train of pack animals exposed under the hot season sun, hooves treading grains like water, fording the absent river at a snoring pace. The scratch and rasp of foliated bone on sand, groan of wood bundles tied against their blistered backs. Their journey was endless, as a boy's eyes would make it seem, seeing their trajectory up a hill and through twisted thorn trees to villages I would never go. But I would return some years later, a few years older, when the clouds emptied like a jug, drops birthed by harmattan wind, my friends and I traversing bog and bird trees, standing under the mighty haraza, a tree so tall the clouds settled in its leaves. The branches marked the four winds. In its roots we found stones brought from the depths of earth, shaped by 1,000 years of ocean, warmed by desert sun and our eager hands. We had waited 3 months to hear the news, to hear of it coming from the southern lake, swelled by rain, turning and overturning the dunes and rocks and roots. Sand turned to mud, turned to liquid, risen 3 feet, then 10. The villagers waiting with fish lines, rushing the word faster, downstream, then the water rose. My friends heard the news on market day, brought it through my door, and so we came, stones in hand, coiling out our wrists in unison. We threw them, a skip, a second, a third, submerged. My friends were always so much more talented at skipping stones across water than I was. But I think what that poem is doing is, celebrating friendship, celebrating what it means to be together in a joyful moment of life, and to be in a place that is special to us. And so for me, LeTourneau is a very similar place. It's a place where we join together, where we fellowship together, where we are able to make a place. And so that's leading me to some different projects here on campus. So I direct the Writing Center, and I see it as a place. I see it as a space that students can enter into, where something that's big for me is the Christian virtue of hospitality. And we usually think of the Writing Center, I think, as a scary place, as a place where you tremble as you walk into, and that's not what we're trying to do at all. What we're trying to do is to provide a welcoming space for students to come, students of all levels and abilities, and to continue to hone their writing, to shape it with the help of tutors. And so that's one thing that I'm working on. I'm also working on several other things, including creating a creative writing club. I found a lot of students who love to design in all shapes and forms. They may be an engineering major, they may be a psychology major, but they love to tell a story. And so my hope is that I can get a group of students together. We've already been getting students jumping in and volunteering for it, and so I want to see that. I'm excited to see that take shape in the months ahead. And finally, this idea of kind of place and placemaking has been something that I've done a little research on and done a lot of thinking on and reading, and so it's going to be a course theme in my spring courses. I'll teach 2 sections of Comp 2, and as my students research and develop research papers, I'm going to ask them to research based on the context of place. So their research will deal with what are some projects, and how does that relate to the land, or relate to community, or relate to the church, or what we need to be doing to strengthen each other and to solve certain issues out in society. And I think that resonates a lot with what we do here at LeTourneau. So I'm excited for it. I hope, and I know that the students will buy in to kind of this idea of placemaking, and I'm very much looking forward to that, to seeing it take shape. So, yeah.